My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are in the midst of a study of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're doing a thematic study of this great chapter. And in our last video, I pointed out to you that there are some linguistic issues at work in 1 Corinthians 15 that scholars have struggled with. They continue to struggle with them. They are struggling with them. And I use that present tense on purpose, by the way, almost as a pun. But the reality is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 35, Paul says, "And now someone will say, how are the dead raised?" Well, that doesn't catch the force of the Greek. How are the dead being raised? And with what body are they coming? Present active or present passive. Now, all sorts of explanations have been given to do away with the force of the present actives. I have been in correspondence with people before who have told me, well, the force of the present actives or the present passives there has to be a future tense because the resurrection hasn't happened. Well, that's presuppositional. That's a priori argumentation. And I am convinced, personally, that the Holy Spirit did not cause Paul to use the present tenses, the present passive tenses, indiscriminately. A good friend of mine, Gerald Davis, who is far more conversant in the Greek than me, by the way, shared with me that some commentators on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 35 argue that, well, what Paul's doing is he is taking what the scoffers are saying. The scoffers are rather derisively saying, well, okay, yeah. If the dead are being raised, with what body are they coming, Paul? If you're going to argue that there's a resurrection of the dead ones, then tell us with what body they're being raised. Not that Paul is affirming that they're being raised, but that the scoffers are scoffing at Paul's claim of the resurrection of the dead ones. Well, I don't believe that those commentators have made a valid argument here. In order for that to be a valid argument, the scoffers would have to be appealing to Paul's statement that the dead were in fact being raised. In other words, the scoffers are scoffing at what Paul is saying. What was Paul saying? Well, in order to catch that, in order to understand that, we go back into the previous verses. Beginning with verse 12, guess what? From verse 12 all the way through verse 32, Paul uses either the present active or the present passive to speak of the dead ones being raised. So it was not the scoffers who were derisively saying that the dead were being raised, as if Paul never said that. No. In these previous verses, and I've got a list of the verses here, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 12. If Christ is, by the way, that's present active indicative. Do we just discount that as well? If Christ is being preached that he has been a perfect indicative, by the way, raised from the dead, how is it that some among you say that the dead, there is no resurrection? Present indicative of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15. If the dead are not raised, yes, we are found false witnesses of God because we have, which is an aorist indicative, by the way, testified of God that he raised up, aorist active indicative, Christ, whom he did not raise up, aorist active indicative, if the dead, in fact, are not being raised. Now, here is Paul clearly affirming that the dead ones were being raised. It was not the scoffers. It was not the scoffers derisively using some kind of non-existing argument by Paul. No, here is Paul affirming that the dead ones were being raised. 1 Corinthians 15:16. if the dead was. Now this is Paul's argument. This is Paul's modus ponens argument. If the dead are not being raised, then Christ is not risen, aorist, active, indicative. So are we to believe that Paul is so indiscriminate in his use of the present active indicative or the present passive indicative when he was so careful, by the way, in his use of the present tenses, when he was so careful about his aorist active indicatives? So he's so careful in his use of the perfect tenses, the aorist perfect or aorist indicative, and in his present tenses, but all of a sudden, when it comes to the present passive indicatives or even the present active indicatives, we don't pay attention to that. So I believe, it seems to me, that when we, and by the way, I didn't even get to all of Paul's uses of the present. Look at 1 Corinthians 15:26. The last enemy to be destroyed, literally the last enemy being destroyed. All right? 1 Corinthians 15:29. By the way, I think this is very powerful. If the dead ones are not raised, otherwise what will they do who are, which is a present participle, who are being baptized for the dead, if the dead are not rising? Why then are they present active, being baptized for the dead? Now, here is a great example of what is known as the iterative present. That means that it is an action that's going on. Doesn't mean that every single moment it's going on, but there is a process, a present process of people being baptized, and that baptism is on the behalf of the dead ones. It's called the iterative present tense. So here is Paul very carefully, very scrupulously using the Greek tenses. He is not using that hypothetically, and he's certainly not using it parenthetically, which is one of the present tenses. No. Just like he accurately uses the aorist active indicative, just like he properly uses the present active, just like he uses the iterative present, Paul uses the present passive indicative. And that means that the resurrection was already in progress. Well, folks, if the resurrection was already in progress, that demands that if the traditional view of Paul's discussion of eschatology and resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 is focused on physical resurrection, it means that physical resurrection was already taking place. Present passive indicative or present active indicative. But that's pretty obviously not a true doctrine. And we've got more on Paul's use of the present passive indicatives and the present active indicatives on the flip side. In the meantime, get a copy of my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, Future or Fulfilled. In that book, even though I do not discuss extensively Paul's use of the present tenses, I do cover it, and I demonstrate how the objections that are offered to Paul's use of the present tenses simply are not tenable. Go to my website, BibleProphecy.com, eschatology.org, order my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Future or Fulfilled. Well, thank you so much, and yes, we've got more on the flip side, so we'll see you there.